Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 1st of December, where we are moving past our drama section and going into our last unit, which happens to be poetry. But if you'll see in the notes below, I've indicated a couple of pieces of information. The first is that paper number 1 is now graded and should have been returned to you. So if you submitted in paper number 1 and did not receive it back, please contact me because it's probably been lost someplace along the way. That does not include revisions for paper number 1. That means you are in the queue if you've submitted in a revision, so to speak. And paper number 2 is going to be due ideally on the 10th of December, which is a Wednesday, but I would take it up until the 17th of December, which is our very last day of class, which is also a Wednesday. Basically, our last day of class is devoted to the final examination, which is going to be devoted mostly to poetry because you haven't had an opportunity to write about short story or to write about drama. And that means that we are going to have 80 points devoted to poetry. It will be an essay examination and open book, open notes, so you can utilize all your resources. And basically, in terms of thinking about poetry, the best way to prepare is to have read all the poems and to have seen all of the classes about poetry. And this being a film class, this also includes a film, which for us will be Dead Poets Society. So that will also be an option for the final examination. And it's just a question of synthesizing everything that we've been doing over the poetry unit. That's 80 points. What's left over are 20 points, 10 points for the fiction section, and 10 points for the drama section. That also includes the films we would have seen in each of those sections. Also essay, but shorter essays, obviously. So you should devote most of your attention to the poetry. If this were a face-to-face class, you'd spend approximately 2 hours taking the exam, which is how much I would expect for you to take, but you have 24 hours in which to submit in that exam. So I will be posting it on the 17th at 10 a.m., which is when our class would normally meet, and it will be due 24 hours later, which would be on the 18th, Thursday at 10 a.m. Again, I'm not expecting anything that is as neat or as polished or as well developed as what you would do for a paper. And that would be the very last time that I would accept a paper from you on the last day of class on the 17th. So more on that later, but basically as we move into the poetry section, you can see that there really is no clear definition for poetry. It'll oftentimes utilize sound, things like rhyme or meter, which happens to be the beat, or alliteration. So rhyme is when the endings of words sound similar. Alliteration is when the beginnings of words sound similar. Expect it to be very dense and compact, which is both good news and bad news. The good news is that you don't need to read as much, but the bad news is that you need to read incredibly carefully. And all semester long, I've been talking about 3 readings. The first reading to understand plot, second reading to begin to interpret, and the third reading to refresh your memory. You have to read 3 times when it comes to poetry. And the shorter the poem, the more likely dense it happens to be. And one of the reasons why I think poetry is oftentimes challenging is because then it's an attempt to describe a feeling with language. And anybody who's ever read, let's say, the definition of a feeling, such as love or hate, knows that's pretty flat compared to actually experiencing it. But I think probably poetry comes the closest to that. Now, the text talks a little bit about how to read poetry responsively. Poetry is meant to be heard. So I suggest, as does the text, that you read the poems out loud, or at the very least, you listen to somebody else reading the poems out loud. I will be providing you with links. Some of those links include professional poetry readers who read the poetry, and some of those links basically include the poets themselves reading their own poetry. And I kind of liken poetry to music, and some of it can be good. The lyrics can be quite complex, and some of it can be very superficial. And part of it is going to be dependent on ultimately the tone, the reader. It isn't just the language. And I wanted to give you a sense of that by having you see two versions of a song that probably are quite familiar to you, at least the song, because it's very iconic. The Sounds of Silence. I'm going to ask you to watch the Simon and Garfunkel clip. This was from their last performance where they were reunited, which was a pretty big deal because they had not performed together in quite a while. There was some bad blood between them, but they resolved their differences. And then to see another version of it done by Disturbed, and actually Simon and Garfunkel indicated that they love Disturbed's version and see it as equal to, if not better than, their own. And I guess we can debate, but the Disturbed version is much more angry, and the Simon and Garfunkel is much more gentle, even though the language is the same. To illustrate how tone and reading can influence interpretation. So, in some ways, it's like drama in the sense that there is a performance aspect to it. Do think about approaching poetry in many of the same ways that we would have approached short story and how we would have also approached drama. And do know that annotating your text is going to be particularly important, as well as I had indicated, rereading poetry multiple times. And the textbook gives you some examples of how to read poetry. I wanted to talk about two poems that the textbook talks about, The Magic of Love and Love Poem, to kind of illustrate the fact that some poetry can be rather simplistic and formulaic, even though it might have musicality to it, like rhyme or meter. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worth reading, but it's probably not worth discussing, as opposed to something that's much more complex. We've done this with Harlequin romances, for instance, when we were talking about um, how formulaic they were, A Secret Sorrow as opposed to A Sorrowful Woman. We've also done this with drama, that some dramas have a lot more complexity than other dramas. And we watch dramas on television, but more often than not, they don't have a lot of complexity to it. Though I've always argued that the television drama Breaking Bad is nothing short of superb, and it's really a retelling of the Oedipus the King myth about maybe not a great man, if you know the main character in Breaking Bad, but someone who experiences downfall, perhaps because of outside forces. So I encourage you to watch Breaking Bad if you've never seen it before. But nevertheless, we can do the same with poetry. And if you're not exposed to poetry through song, then chances are you are exposed through poetry through greeting cards, if people still basically exchange greeting cards in this time and age. But they give you an example of a greeting card poem by Helen Ferries. The date is unknown. Um, and this would have appeared on a greeting card called The Magic of Love. And I'll read it to you. And it reads, "There's a wonderful gift that can give you a lift. It's a blessing from heaven above. It can comfort and bless. It can bring happiness. It's the wonderful magic of love. Like a star in the night, it can keep your faith bright. Like the sun, it can warm your hearts too. It's a gift you can give every day that you live, and when given, it comes back to you. When love lights the way, there's joy in the day, and all troubles are lighter to bear. Love is gentle and kind, and through love you will find there's an answer to your every prayer. May it never depart from your two loving hearts. May you treasure this gift from above. You will find if you do, all your dreams will come true. It's the wonderful magic of love." It has rhyme and it does have meter. You can hear the sound, but it's very simplistic. It almost reminds me of roses are red and violets are blue and sugar is sweet and so are you. It doesn't have a whole lot of depth or complexity to it. Chances are you read it once, you understand what it says. It's very generic, as a greeting card should be, so that it can sell the largest number of greeting cards to appeal to the widest audience. That is compared to another poem about love, but a very different kind of poem by John Frederick Nims. This was written in 1947, entitled Love Poem. And it reads, "My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases, at whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bowls in china and burrs in linen, and have no cunning with any soft thing, except all at ease fidgeting people. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steadied the drunk clamoring on his undulant floor. Unpredictable dear, the taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights pale as a dime. Yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, misfit in any space and never on time. A wrench in clocks and the solar system. Only with words and people in love you move at ease. In a traffic of wit expertly maneuver and keep us all devotion at your knees. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel, your lipstick grinning on our coat. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, our souls on gloria's spilt bourbon float. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study rye music for your sake. For should your hands drop wide and empty, all the toys of the world would break. And the difference between the two probably is that at the ending of Love Poem, you thought, what? As opposed to at the ending of The Magic of Love, which was pretty clear, which is why you usually need to do multiple readings. One of the things I recommend you do, and the text does as well, is that you might want to paraphrase the poem, put it into your own language. And then what you can do is something called explicate, which sounds like explanation. And that means going through it word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, to try to determine anything and everything that could be important. And usually we explicate shorter pieces because you really wouldn't be able to keep that up over, let's say, a several hundred-page novel. But you could do this with, let's say, a poem that's a few lines long or even a few stanzas long. And if you're looking at the poem, The Magic of Love, you'll see that it's divided up into sections that look almost by paragraphs. Those are called stanzas. And much like a paragraph, it usually serves the same function, that it talks about a particular topic. But of course, you can break rules in poetry in the way that you couldn't necessarily break rules in other genres of writing. And probably one of the biggest rules is that you've got the staggered line in poetry, as opposed to when you are writing prose, that ultimately you're writing from one end of the line to another, and when you're writing complete sentences, or one end of the piece of paper to another, or one end of the screen to the other. But when you are writing something like poetry, you can decide to end a line early, and even though there's a lot more space left to the screen or the paper, and begin a new line. And then you can ask yourself, why did the poet make that decision to break up a line? It might not even necessarily be the ending of a sentence. And in terms of love poem, we assume from the title, and titles are so important, that this is a poem that's supposed to express love. And yet, the first stanza begins by actually pointing out the flaws of the subject, that this person is my clumsiest dear. And while dear is a term of endearment, clumsy is usually has negative connotations. Hands, not just break vases, shipwreck, disaster. Who's all quick touch, all glasses chip and ring. They're always breaking things. In other words, things are always chipping and ringing. Palms are bulls in China, which is based on the expression of a bull in a china shop, somebody who is very clumsy amongst very delicate things. Burrs and linen. And a burr happens to be a stickly plant that oftentimes will catch itself on clothing. And no cunning with any soft thing. So basically, the first stanza is talking about the negatives that the subject has. They are basically awkward and clumsy. The next stanza talks about the positives. So this is a shift in tone, beginning with the word accept. Accept all the ill, fidgeting people. In other words, this person has grace with people who are fidgeting and feel ill at ease. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. And a refugee, someone who's homeless, who's looking for home. So can you imagine somebody who's so socially awkward, who has social anxiety to the point where they feel as if they are a refugee at your front door, and yet you have the ability to make them feel welcomed and wanted, which is a skill. It's a social skill. You steady the drunk clamoring on his undulant floor. Somebody who's had a little bit too much to drink at your home. How do you get them home safely and with dignity? It's not an easy thing to do. So this person has grace with people. And then the third stanza, again, more critique. Unpredictable dear. And while dear is a term of endearment, the idea that this person is unpredictable is usually seen as a negative. The taxi driver's terror. And at the time of this poem in the 1940s, and actually until rather recently, taxi drivers came with the stereotype of being very aggressive, irresponsible drivers. So, how bad of a driver must this person be for taxi drivers to be afraid of them? This person shrinks from far headlights, pale as a dime. The person who is afraid to make a left turn, even though the headlights of the oncoming car are far, far away. Yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars. So this is also the person that will cross the train tracks at the last minute and almost get hit. In other words, they're a very poor driver. Misfit in any space and never on time. And in fact, we're told in the next stanza that this person, and in the next stanza, we're going to have a combination of negative and positive, is a wrench in clocks and solar system. So can you imagine how much they must disrupt time, how early or late they must be, how unpredictable they must be to have that kind of power? Only with words, people, and love you move at ease. So this is the person's talent in social relationships. In a traffic of wit, expertly maneuver. I love that term because we've been talking about traffic with driving, and driving has a lot of parallels to having conversations or relationships. Some are skilled at it, some are not. Um, it gets better with practice. It could be stop and go. You can get into an accident where somebody gets hurt or even killed, and we can continue on with the commonalities between the two. Traffic of wit, expertly maneuver, and keep us all devotion at your knees. That's how much they love the subject of this poem, is that they're literally kneeling in front of her. That's why they're at her knees. And I would say it's a her because of the next stanza. Forgetting your coffee, spreading on our flannel. So this is a person who always spills food, not just on themselves, but others. Your lipstick grinning on our coat. And considering the time period, 1947, not to say that men couldn't wear lipstick, but my suspicion is that it would be much more accepted for a female to do so. And that is probably what's being referenced in this poem, that this is a female who's leaving makeup behind, makeup stains. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, that love can't be broken, unlike objects. Our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. So if you've ever heard the expression, don't cry over spilled milk, in this instance it's spilled bourbon. Bourbon can be quite expensive. But the idea that something is spilled or something is broken means that the person is nearby. So they celebrate that idea. Be with me, darling, early and late. Doesn't matter if you're early or you're late. Smash glasses that whenever I hear something breaking, it feels like rye music. For should your hands drop white and empty, in other words, if you were to die, all the toys of the world would break, which I think is such a powerful line. Toys and all of the associations of youth and happiness and play, all of that would disappear if this person wasn't there. So if you got nothing else out of these two poems, obviously the poem that I've gone through, Love Poem by John Frederick Mills, has a lot more sophistication than The Wonderful Magic of Love. So just because a poem has rhyme, or just because a poem has meter or alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good poem. Another poem that you are given to illustrate how to go about read poetry is a poem called Catch. And it's an interesting poem because it basically is an extended metaphor where we're likening the game of catch to reading poetry and writing poetry, where on the surface it wouldn't sound like that they have a lot of similarities, but in reality, especially if we go through the poem, they do have a lot of similarities. And the poem reads, and it was written in 1950 by Robert Francis. Two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now fool him slowly. Anything, everything, tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. Over the tree in the long sweet cadence down. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And now like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. And If we want to think about paraphrasing this poem, is that a poet's relationship to a reader is very similar to a game of catch. And I think that we use a lot of the same terms with both. When we're talking about two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together, it could be two boys uncoached who are throwing a ball together in a game of catch. Two being because somebody has to throw and somebody has to catch. Boys, when you think about the time of this poem, 1950, I think it would be considered male-centric to be a poet or to be analyzing poetry. And the game of catch as well. Even in today's stage, I mean, professional sports basically are devoted to males. Certainly baseball and catch are. And overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. That repetition of hand, which makes it musical, is basically also how catch is played. You use hands, but it's also how you write poetry with your hands and how you read poetry or should read poetry. You should be annotating or taking notes with your hand. Teasing, perhaps that's what poetry is. It's teasing. It's giving you a workout, if you will, much like playing a game of catch. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. So here we can see the rhyme. The endings of the words are the same. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. So again, we're going to have to work and stretch our muscles, both with reading and writing poetry, and also with playing a game of catch to make it interesting. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Maybe that's what poetry is. It tries to fool you. It doesn't say things directly. You need to interpret. Anything, everything. Maybe that's what poetry is. Anything, everything. Tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. And maybe that's the point of poetry, to outwit. Over the tree in the long, sweet cadence down. Cadence being a musical sound. And poetry is so musical. But a ball can also make a sound in the air as it whistles through the air. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And I guess that's what we're doing with poetry. We're scrambling to pick up the meaning, maybe even more so than we were in the other two units of drama and fiction. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Lots of alliteration there, the repetition of initial consonant sounds, the P, which also stands for poetry. So, that said, a couple of other suggestions for poetry is that you can scan a poem. And scanning a poem means identifying all of the elements that work within a poem from a writing standpoint. And this is very similar to diagramming a sentence, if you've ever done something like that in an English class, where you go through a sentence and you have to identify the parts of speech in a sentence, how many nouns and verbs and prepositions and so forth. The idea is that if you understand how a sentence is structured, it should help you write a sentence. I'm not so sure I believe that, but nevertheless, if you are going to diagram a sentence, then you need to talk about how and why that might be important in a piece of literature that you're reading. So, just saying that in Young Goodman Brown, there are 3 nouns and 4 verbs in the first sentence is my response is going to be, so what? Now, if you can make an argument that, let's say, the pronoun I is used 47 times, and I'm making things up at this point, and that Young Goodman Brown is a very self-centered character, and it's always about me, I. At least that's an argument about how the grammar might work with the themes. And I say this because it's very similar with scanning a poem. You can go through a poem, and you can identify the elements of the poem, the rhyme, for instance, or the meter, or alliteration, or many of the other elements. And again, my response is going to be, well, yeah, so what? That ultimately you need to relate it to the poem itself. And if you can't relate it to the poem itself, then probably it's not worth talking about, just like if you were diagramming a sentence. And in terms of waiting for the storm, if you are reading this in a textbook, you might see that it's already been scanned for you. Now, I'm providing links for the poems as well. So, unfortunately, the link that I provided does not show that it's scanned. And the reason and the way that you would see this is because there would be line divisions, slashes, in between all of the syllables. And that means that a reader has scanned that poem to indicate the beat or the rhythm. And the poem reads, if it wasn't scanned, it's the way you're supposed to read it. And it was written in 1986 by Timothy Steele, Waiting for the Storm. Breathed scents of wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head. And basically, if we were to go through this poem and try to paraphrase it, the title is the clue. This is somebody who's waiting for a storm, and there's a breeze that's sending a wrinkling darkness across the bay. So they're by a body of water, and things are getting dark. A storm is approaching. I knelt beneath an upturned boat. So basically, they're looking for shelter underneath an upturned boat. And moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder. So we see a transition here in the weather. The damp air chill and spread. And again, the idea of chill and spread is that we could talk a little bit about how ultimately the inclement weather is growing. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head. So now it's beginning to rain, and this person is underneath the hull of a boat because ultimately they had taken shelter there. But if we were to read it the way it should be scanned, or the way it would be read if it were scanned, it would read something like this. I'm going to try to provide a beat, much like the drum beat that you might be provided with a song, which is why it's so much easier to listen to music, because you've got instruments to reinforce sound. But it would read something like this. Present a wrinkling darkness across the bay I knelt, beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. And again, my response usually is, so what? Unless you can relate it to the poem. And you might have noticed that the beat of that poem would mimic, let's say, the beat of raindrops, the sounds of raindrops over the hull of a boat, because it's probably made out of wood or metal, so it would be very audible. And that the tempo increases. In other words, the raindrops are getting faster as the storm is approaching. So this is a great example of how ultimately the rhythm of a poem, the meter of a poem, reinforces the theme. So in that particular instance, it's worth discussing. And another poem they give you that's been scanned, but in this particular time, that it's been scanned for rhyme. And this is something that we talked a little bit about when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman, when she was thinking about writing a sonnet, and how she was thinking about maybe it should be A, B, B, or A, B. And those are ways that you can identify the pattern of rhyme in a poem. That basically what we do is we look at the last word of each line, and we use the letters of the alphabet in order to determine that pattern. And the first rhyme that we encounter, the last word of the first line, would be identified with an A, and anything that rhymes with that would be considered an A. And likewise, once we get a new rhyme at the ending of a line, that would be identified with the next letter of the alphabet, which would be a B, and anything that rhymes with that would be a B, and so forth and so on. And if you find a pattern, well, then the question is, how and why is that pattern important? It's not worth discussing unless you can make an argument about its importance. So, Upon Julia's Close, which was written in 1648 by Robert Herrick, very short poem, only 6 lines long. But as I had indicated, the shorter it is, usually the denser it is. And the poem reads, Upon Julia's close. When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. And if we were going to go for rhyme, at the ending of the first line, the word is goes. So goes would be identified with an A in the alphabet. Anything that rhymes with the word goes would be an A. The next line ends with the word flows, and flows rhymes with goes, so it would be a repetition of an A. The third line, close, rhymes with flows and goes, so it's A. All of that is one stanza. And then our next stanza, the line ends with the word see, And C does not rhyme with goes, flows, or close, so we would go to the next letter of the alphabet, which is a B. So anything that rhymes with the word C would be identified as a B. And next line ends with the word free. Free rhymes with C, so it would be a repetition of a B. And the very last line, which ends with me, rhymes with C and free, so that's also another B. So we have a poem that is A, B, B, B. And again, we'd have to talk about how and why that would be significant to the poem, or else why discuss it. And basically what we're told in the first stanza is that, or well, even in the title, that this probably has something to do with someone named Julia and Julia's clothes. And considering the time period in which this was written, 1648, Julia is probably female, because that's usually considered to be a female name. When as in silks my Julia goes. So Julia is wearing silk clothing. And silk is oftentimes associated with privilege, with money, and also with nightwear, things like negligee. Then methinks how sweetly flows. And silk, if you know anything about it, it's a beautiful material that drapes lovely. It flows very much so. One of the reasons why it's so expensive. That liquefaction of her clothes. I love the word liquefaction because if you've ever seen silk move, or when we talk about something being silky, it's almost like a liquid moving. So those are her clothes. That's one stanza. The next stanza, so something has happened after that. When I cast mine eye and see that brave vibration each way free. That's the hard line. And the assumption is that she is free of her clothing. So now she's nude. Oh, how that glittering taketh me. And if that is indeed the case, the rhyme scheme makes perfect sense because we've got two states. Julia clothed, that's the A rhyme of the first stanza. Julia unclothed, that is the B rhyme of the second stanza. So this is a rather risque poem in many respects, especially considering the time period where we're talking about the 1600s, a little bit after Shakespeare, 1648. So again, I just wanted you to know how to scan a poem. And the reality is that you could scan poems, but if you are going to scan a poem, talk a little bit about how and why that's important. Just like if you're going to diagram a sentence in a piece of literature, talk about how and why that would be important. If not, then it's probably better off that you don't talk about it. Now, some of the upcoming poems that we're going to be reading are listed as handout poems. I've provided links for those. You can see those at the bottom of the page, though I will also be providing links for all of the poems as well in the event that you don't have the textbook. And as I indicated, the film we're going to be seeing and talking about next class, Dead Poets Society, is a film that's very much associated with poetry, but lots of other things. So for today's attendance question, which would be due on Wednesday the 3rd, and certainly if you need additional time, let me know. And I know that I've fallen behind with the my responses to your discussion forum questions. I plan on catching up this week. And you are not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And the question is about paper number 2, because now it's time to start thinking about paper number 2 now that we've put some closure onto drama. What do you think, at least at this point, that you would write paper number 2 about and why? And again, you can change your mind. You're not necessarily committed at this point, but I want you to begin thinking about paper number 2 and utilizing the suggestions that I had indicated in paper number 1 for paper number 2. Now, that said, that assumes that you can read my handwriting. So if not, certainly reach out to me and I will be happy to decipher for you. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about, well, poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.